What potential do SMRs hold for the future? And how can they contribute to this nuclear renaissance, which is a phrase I've heard more today than ever in any other day I've ever had? So we're going to form another little panel now. So can I please invite Chris Lewis, EY's lead infrastructure partner, to the stage, Mike Tynan, Chief Executive Officer at the Nuclear Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, and Mike Middleton, Strategy Manager from the Energy Technologies Institute, to join me. Thank you very much for joining me. So, as with all our panels, I don't know if you've been watching our panels earlier, but firstly, I'd like to sort of get you to introduce yourselves, particularly as we have a two-mic issue here, so we need to introduce the two mics. But can you please give me your overview of your thoughts on SMRs for the next 20 years or so in the UK?
Yeah, shall I go first?
Yes.
So, thank you first for inviting me along. I think small modular reactors are a kind of really interesting time to look at them. So I've been, our view of the market is we've obviously got a lot of renewable technology coming in into the grid. We expect to see a lot more demand as electric vehicles come through, and we see more about home heating solutions come on. So we expect that the need for always available power to be strong, continue to be strong, and that's why I think we see a strong future for nuclear power. And really, when I look at the challenges of nuclear power in the UK going forward, I think I was looking for a kind of similar analogy, and one of my old school friends recently wrote a book, so indulge me with a long analogy, if you don't mind, about the merchant adventurers in the 16th century. So at that time, the UK was right on the edge of the world, and in order to do trade with China and the Near East, we had to follow the long Portuguese trading route. And we often lost ships, we had to pay high tariffs, it was very expensive. And the merchants set up this group called the Company of Merchant Adventurers, and the idea there was that there was a shorter, faster, quicker route over the northeast, and we just needed to discover it. And we needed to work out, so we didn't have a map, we didn't have any experience, but they wanted to set up a company that found a new route. And I think that's similar to where we are with nuclear today. I think large nuclear power is, in order to create a nuclear power plant in the UK, you need to, a bit like doing trade with China 500 years ago, you need to raise money, took 20 billion. You need to go and convince governments to support the project over a generation type payback. You need to mobilise 20,000 people to go and build it, and then you've got roughly an 8-year development cycle and probably an 8-year build cycle. So that seems pretty hard.
Well, with the merchant adventurers, nobody fell off the edge, but that doesn't mean that there weren't challenges to overcome. So we'll maybe talk about the challenges in a minute.
I think the potential prize for small modular reactors is exactly that. It's cheaper to develop. Potentially it's much quicker to market. It's a bit like making automotive, where you design the car once and you repeat build, and then you can install it. So it seems like a good promise of future. The question is, how do we make that work?
Thank you. And if you can introduce yourself and tell us your view on SMRs.
Okay. Well, I'm Mike Tynan, Chief Executive Nuclear AMRC. SMRs and thoughts on SMRs. I think in the last 3 years, if I had a penny for every time someone had asked for a thought on SMR, I'd be able to retire a wealthy man. So next 20 years with SMR, well, a good start would be to build one.
Sounds like a sensible move. Yeah.
So why are we not building an SMR at the moment? I think there's two issues. One is around the technology itself. And I think for me, there's a number of valid SMR technologies for the UK. And with enough investment, I think each one of them could be licensed. So I don't think the challenge is a technology challenge. The challenge for SMR is, what's the economic case? What's the route to market for SMR? And if you're going to have volume production of an SMR, someone must buy in volume. So I tend to work with people who can claim to make in volume But the challenge is who will buy in volume. And I think the difficulty in startup of a potential SMR program for the UK is where is the clarity on that economic case? What will the price of electricity from an SMR look like? What will access to the volume market look like? Because the UK of itself will not be able to provide the market big enough for volume production, and therefore there must be access to a global market. So once you get access to the global market, you're then with global players. And the challenge, therefore, to me, for SMR is an economic one and not a technology one.
Thank you, Mike, for setting out your stall there. And could you introduce yourself and tell us your perspective on it?
Thank you. So my name is Mike Middleton. I landed in the Energy Technologies Institute in 2013 as the strategy manager for nuclear. And the government had a nuclear industrial strategy that mentioned small modular reactors. So I had to get to grips with what I thought these were, what the industry thought it were, and could they have a role in a transition to a low-carbon economy? Because for me, the interesting thing that the ETI does is it has a database of hundreds of different technologies and plots their availability, their prices, their deployment rates, in order to look for a transition to a low-carbon economy that's affordable. Because anyone can trash an economy in decarbonise. The trick is to limit it to around 1% of GDP. So we want to understand how SMRs could play a role in this system, and could they find a niche that was competitive, where they were part of that lowest cost solution. And I think the information and data says there's still a lot of uncertainty about small modular reactors in actually what the cost of deployment be, what the cost of electricity will be, and what the volume is you need to make that market work. But what we also found is that heat is a really challenging part to decarbonise the economy. About 20% of our carbon emissions come from domestic heat. And decarbonising electricity is hard, but it's easy compared with decarbonising heat. And in decarbonising heat, there's a whole range of solutions, from electric heating through to air source pumps, heat source pumps, through district heating systems, and even repurposing the gas grid. But in our models, we found that district heating was actually quite an important potential vector for the future for decarbonising heat. And we found that there was potentially a role for small modular reactors in delivering both power to the grid, but also low carbon heat into district heating systems to decarbonising heat in our towns and cities. And although that's quite challenging to get your head around, I think from some of the information that CNC has put out in their markets in China, that's probably one of their routes to market in China, is in combined heat and power plants around their inland cities to clean up the air and get away from these coal smogs. So it's finding a role for SMRs, and I'm not convinced it's going toe-to-toe with large nuclear on baseload electricity production.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have Chris, Mike and Mike. Any questions for them, please? They're a very quiet bunch this afternoon. So, Mike, just picking you up on that combined heat and power thing, it's not something that's being done on any kind of a large scale, is it? So what are the practicalities for moving heat?
So there's a perception it's not done on scale. And here in the UK, you know, we've grown up being comfortable with natural gas, most of us with the comfort and convenience of boilers. But there are 2,000 heat networks in the UK, and about 2% of our current domestic heat is delivered by heat networks. The thing is, it's just not British. That's the challenge. But if you go to other parts, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, then district heating systems are widely deployed. They're even deployed as retrofits. It's not just something you have to put in a new build system. So district heating systems are proven. And even district heating energised by nuclear is proven. There's the twin unit Besnau plant in Switzerland that's been doing this for decades. So it's proven. But it's just one of those choices. And for us going forward, we have a range of solutions to decarbonise heat. And we need to come to a view whether actually district heating is proven elsewhere, is it a choice for us? And how do we want to energise that system? Because there's a range of choices. But it's not new. It's just not very British.
So a change of mindset perhaps needed rather than any real obstacles, would you say?
Obstacles, though, I mean, you picture what it means, pipes in the streets, it's challenging. That's hard, so I'm not saying it's an easy choice, but if you do it just by directive electric resistive heating to decarbonising heat, you're probably expanding the grid by a further 50% in terms of capacity. You have to replace all the substations, all the wiring in the street. None of that can cope with the magnitude of electrical supply to need all at home. So the alternatives are all hard, so it's difficult choices ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Mike, were you saying earlier that about not knowing what the cost of the electricity produced would be? So how can we get a grip on that then?
Yeah, well, that is a great question. We have one data point for electricity pricing from nuclear new build at the moment, and that's the EDF Areva EPR scheme at Hinkley Point in Somerset, where the agreed strike price is £92.50 per megawatt hour or £89.50 if Sizewell goes ahead. So I think the challenge is, if we make an argument on SMR that one of the reasons for doing it is we will get cheaper electricity, then that probably falls into a policy set that's about an economic transition to a low-carbon economy. So it benefits the economy, benefits the consumer. However, if you come at it from the other angle and say, is it about creating industrial value in the UK? So we help to create and sustain or create a new manufacturing base for SMR, which sustains advanced manufacturing in the UK. Then is it about the price of electricity, or is it about an economic policy, industrial strategy that says we will create long-term, sustainable, indigenous, high-value manufacturing in the UK? So they're two quite different policy drivers. So what I'm encouraged about is that government sort of recognised that and said, well, let's combine two departments that have those policies. So DEC had the energy policy and BIS had industrial strategy, or it's now industrial strategy again. So we've now got those in the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. So I've got some hope that there'll be a coming together of those two strategies. But I think, personally, that for the UK, we need to ensure that if we develop an SMR programme, that we create sustainable home value. Otherwise, we could just buy in power, and therefore it might be important, is the price of electricity from SMR lower than that of a big unit? But I think ultimately it's not the real differentiator to get this programme going. It's about a long-term energy policy that looks at a sustainable balance of energy that includes the delivery of baseload power. And I have to say I agree entirely with Mike on district heating. Somewhere in the equation we have to address that issue.
And throw that into the equation early as well.
I think so. Otherwise, we don't want to be in our usual position of trying to backfit something. It's actually a real policy challenge. And I don't think people realise.
Well, according to Mike, retrofit is available.
Well, it would be, but I was talking in a similar forum in Sheffield yesterday, and the discussion was really about decarbonising power and particularly heating. And I don't think people realise that the UK is probably the home of the greatest number of domestic gas boilers in the world. It's how we do it. And there was a chap talking about the electrification of transport, cars, and he was talking about 2021. And would it occur en masse in the spring or the summer of 2021, which I thought was a very precise timescale. But we have to address those challenges as part of the overall provision of baseload electricity.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Any questions for our panel? Yes, we have a question here. We can get a microphone down to the 1, 2, 3, 4th row there.
Hello, Terry Buckle from Astute Technical Recruitment. In a former career, I was a nuclear engineer in the Royal Navy, and our exposure to being the closer proximity of the nuclear reactor was governed by a system called ALARP, as low as reasonably practicable, I think is a word. SMR sounds very interesting, but the idea of having multiple nuclear reactors in different venues around the country seems to be at odds with ALARP. Now, admittedly, that was a military organisation rather than civil, but is there something that we need to overcome to enable us as a society to be able to have more smaller reactors around the country?
So, Mike, your report looked at siting, didn't it?
We did look at siting.
Could that answer this question?
Part of the driver for looking at siting is some of the scenarios for deployment of large reactors involved quite a significant number of plants and quite a lot of capacity. And subsequent analysis has gone on to show that in England and Wales, the number of sites suitable for large reactors is quite limited. And that could be a constraint on capacity and deployment. But we also took the opportunity to where you could deploy small modular reactors against the same siting criteria in place for large nuclear. And we found that there were places that you could put clusters of small plants in locations where you couldn't put big nuclear units, but meeting the same criteria. And I think in terms of getting a mindset around the number of plants and what this means, then we should go back and look at the early days of the Magnox programme and actually how many different reactor units there were around the country that formed the basis of our generation. And there were many, many sites at that time. And the capacity of the Magnox units is not incomparable with small modular reactors. I think next, it's unrealistic to expect every town has its own SMR, because it simply doesn't work. And you should look for these things to be deployed as multiple units on one site rather than one or two units together. But you could be looking at locations for SMRs where there have not been nuclear power operations before. And I think public acceptability is a key feature here. We've got as good a support for nuclear power in the country that we've had for many, many years. And I think you need a democratic mandate and you need to take that forward with local consultation. And so if the UK moves into supporting a deployment of a small modular reactor programme, then I think there will be some sites needed. And I think it's vital that the selection of that first site is considered very, very carefully. And my logic for this is when you want to move to potentially other locations, those communities want to know what living with nuclear power means, what it looks like, and who will they want to go to. And they will choose to go to the host community for the first one. They will want to understand what it looks like living with nuclear power. So I think it could involve more sites. Deployment of SMRs. I think public acceptability is key, and I think careful and responsible development by a developer is absolutely important in creating that confidence and trust to move forward.
Thank you.
Just to introduce another aspect to that as well, and that is the regulator. So all of our developed sites are nuclear license sites. For this generation of nuclear reactors, we have to go through a generic design assessment, then through site licensing and consenting. And I agree entirely with Mike that I think we will see more sites available and sites will be designated. However, I think we can take great confidence from the fact that we have a world-leading regulator. Our nuclear program is safe. And that were we to develop a new fleet of reactors that are small modular reactors and on an increased number of sites, then I think we can take confidence that those will be properly licensed and that they'll be undoubtedly be safe. The question about addressing this with the public is really important.
I think there's a big cost question to this. You know, there's a reason why people are building 2 units, even at the big plant, on the same site. And there's a reason why people are trying to build multiple sites for the big plants, and that's because there are huge economies of scale in nuclear, and there will be huge economies of scale in small nuclear as well. So I think we're going to see a lot of co-siting. I think there's going to be multiple units on one site, because it's going to cost money, it's going to cost time and effort to get public acceptability for nuclear power to be in the region. And back to your point earlier, Mike, about building one, I don't think we'll ever build one. I think we'll either build 100 or we'll build none.
Yeah.
Because I think we need to treat this a bit like an Apple iPhone or a car. You either build mass production, you pick the right one. I think we've got a very strong regulatory environment, a very strong site and planning framework. That means you need to get the acceptance, and they create the economies of scale. And in order for small modular reactors to be effective, they need volume, they need design certainty, and they need consistency. And that's the challenge.
So, attributes for small modular reactor success: clustering, consulting with the siting, a well-known confidence in the regulation of the energy production. Anything else?
It's going to be like automotive and airplanes. You design it, you get approval for the design, and you mass produce it. And so it'll be about factory production using people that are 80% productive on sites where they work is 46, I think, % productive. So massive efficiency gain from moving more of it into factory productions and on-site assembly.
But in terms of this acceptance thing, and you cite automotive, and I think you're talking about electric and stuff, but let's take an extreme example. I first drove an autonomous car, or rather it drove me, because it was an autonomous car, in 1993. That's a very, very long time ago. And it was a slightly unnerving business, but I met the people behind it. The kit was all really big and clunky, but of course now, with the sensors on the back being this big instead of this big as they were, you no longer need a Humvee to have your autonomous vehicle. It's small vehicles. And the technology has been honed and refined, and it's much more reliable. And the whole thing really that's stopping autonomous vehicles going crazy and really catching on is us. It's people wanting to drive, because the most successful autonomous vehicle system is a system where there isn't a mixture of autonomous vehicles and people who cut vehicles up and do unpredictable things. And it's a really smooth, managed system, and it's a cultural change. My daughter got all excited about autonomous vehicles and said, so I won't have to learn to drive, I'll just get in and let it take me. And I said, no, you will. Because in your lifetime, people will be very reticent to give up driving. And it's a whole cultural shift. And here we have this cultural shift with the siting of nuclear plants. And we've heard earlier today, in areas where nuclear is known, nuclear is accepted and it's fine and it's not deemed a risk or anything like that. Where it is not known, there is a very different reaction. And is it going to be the cultural elements that hold us off much longer than the practical elements?
I think there's a fundamental difference between the example of the car and, say, SMR. I take your point about the cultural change. When you're in the car, you're, forgive me, in the driving seat or being driven in a seat in a car, so you're in contact with the product. People are sort of once removed from electricity production. So if you speak to the man in the pub on a Friday night and say, who's responsible for electricity production in the UK, he may or may not know who provides his electricity. He certainly won't know how the price of electricity is arrived at. And so people in this country, and probably other countries as well, they expect electricity when you press the button, whether the wind's blowing or the sun's shining. They don't actually think about where it's coming from. Some people who are concerned about about our climate and the impact on the economy of moving to a low carbon delivery do think about it, but generally people just expect electricity to be there. They only notice it when it's not there, and then generally panic. So
it has to be cheaper, doesn't it?
It has to be cheaper to catch the imagination and for people's pockets. But I do think there is this huge issue of informing and educating the public, not just about nuclear, but generally about how it gets its energy. And if you're interested, you do find lots of information on this. But if you're not generally interested, the information doesn't hit you in the face. And I think we have a big issue in educating the general public on energy in general, rather than just nuclear. And then nuclear becomes a means of supplying energy. But I think that's a challenge for us that we've not really addressed substantially in the last 5 to 10 years, particularly around nuclear.
I'll pick up on your car analogy, because that does work for me, because you're an investor. You've got choice. You can invest in a car that's got autonomous technology or not. So you're an investor and you're making a choice. And I think that has a good parallels with SMRs. You know, the key here is actually investors, because you need to get an investment community that's prepared to procure a big enough volume to make the biggest business proposition work. And they have to be confident that they can make a bet the company investment. For the developers and operators that would envisage these, it's a big deal. And then one of the things to think about is SMRs, the way that some people describe it, there's 2-step changes in it. There's the first one, which is the business model of how you deliver it, how you put it together and deploy it, the factory production, the higher productivity, short construction time. But there's also, as well, the type of design of reactor is it? What reactor type is it? The technology it produces. And I think one of the questions is for investors, is 2 steps at once too much? Is that too much investor risk? Or a step where, well, I understand how this type of reactor works, but you're packaging it and deploying it differently, and I can understand how that works. But if you bring those 2 steps together, is that too much, you know, in terms of achieving the investor confidence that you need? So your analogy did work for me.
Well, it's something to keep an eye on, and I look forward to talking to you perhaps in a year's time and seeing how we've moved on that. But for now, Mike and Chris, thank you very much indeed.